Svana took up the scroll and wound the wooden spools to read. Objective imagination, commerce. The application of intent in the market gives rise to the content that provisions the organisms that rely on the market. In the development of either objective or subjective growth of structure and resulting content, influence must be injected. The injection of influence requires energy be committed by the influencing organism. Due to fundamental uncertainty, the organism must calculate its injection of influence to the extent of its ability to discern the factors at play. Understanding the factors at play requires consideration of the structure of their influence from apex intent to peripheral manifestation of expressive content. The factors at play are the influential forces of organisms, individually and collectively, and the balance of potential benefit and harm that can be attributed to those organisms. In addressing influence to those organisms for purposes of growth or governance, the influencing organism must apply itself to the apex of the specific interest sought to be influenced within the organism. Objective and subjective growth. Uncertainty and reliance. Fundamental uncertainty. Infinitude of factors. In any given environment, the correctness of an intentional choice is always fundamentally uncertain. This is because while the perspective of the organism and its ability to intentionally influence are finite, the environment itself is infinite. The organism may only consider that which it has observed of that which is potentially available to be observed. That which is potentially available to be observed is a segment of the environment that has provisioning relevance to the organism. Within the environment, some manifestation has greater relevance to a given organism than other manifestation. The organism, through its development, learns what is more relevant and what is less relevant. This development of understanding is what allows the organism to navigate its environment, to secure the provisioning it requires to sustain itself, so as to reproduce towards the manifestation of potential. If the organism is to take account of more than is required for innate existence, it must have sufficiently considered and secured its innate requirements to allow it the opportunity to consider, in addition, manifestation that is indirectly relevant and manifestation that is directly relevant. Even directly relevant manifestation cannot be understood completely, but it must be understood to the extent of immediate functional purpose. Immediate functional purpose takes into account the appearance of a given organism to another in the context of a specific defined interaction. Each entity provides a different appearance to each different organism that perceives it, and always according to functional purpose. For there to be functional purpose, there must be relevance, and where there is relevance and investment in the exploration of that relevance, a degree of reliance applies. This reliance is on the impression made and its alignment with the purpose that instigated the interaction such that the relevant organisms may benefit without unnecessary loss, with the possibility of achieving potential intact, and with the probability of growth secured. While immediate functional purpose takes into account what it may in the given circumstances, there is always more at play within the interacting organisms themselves, and also within the environment in which they exist. These unknown factors, to the extent they cannot be accounted for, have the potential to shift circumstances to an extent that may undermine or even potentially make irrelevant the purported interaction itself. They also have the potential to cause intended manipulations to have unintended effects. These unintended effects may bolster the organism's intent, or they may utilize the organism's investment towards outcomes that were not intended within the organism's conscious purpose. It is thus never possible for the organism, even after extensive consideration, to have certainty in calculating the totality of the result of its investment. It is only possible to determine the results of manipulation with incomplete certainty, and only up to the present point. From that present point, the individual perspective can only, at best, invest according to shifting probabilities of outcome of which it is only partially aware. Fundamental uncertainty. Information imbalance. No perspectives are entirely equal in any given context. Each perspective varies in power of perception as a matter of accuracy pertaining to both depth and breadth of import. In addition, individual perspectives inevitably are focused on a varying array of concerns as a matter of differing intent as pertinent to their differing position. In any given case, differing intent causes encountered manifestation to provide a different appearance, and thus a differing array of influential characteristics. In that difference, there is the potential for the varying perspectives to take more or less of the potential import of the considered manifestation into account. This is because the respective sets of characteristics perceived are not equal in import as to the intention and the potential of the considered manifestation. Where inequality of considered import exists, an information imbalance exists between different organisms in their investment where the considered manifestation is concerned. This information imbalance reflects not only the difference in the potential for raw perception in each organism, but also the difference in the rational ability to calculate probability of outcome resulting from manipulation based on that which has been perceived. The information imbalance allows an advantage to be capitalized by the organism with the greater ability to identify, import, and process information relevant to its interest, and to manipulate through investment on the basis of its increased and relatively superior understanding. Through this process, hierarchies of control develop in which the organisms with the greatest ability to access and employ functional information to the advantage of their interests, whether subjective or objective, benefit to the degree of the difference between their ability and that of competing organisms within the context of the given environment. The superior position gives rise to the potential benefit of increased ability through the use of peripheral supporting interests to further feed and collectively employ manipulative intent towards the interests of the superior position. Where that benefit is realized, the dynamic of the interplay of influential power through difference in informational import crystallizes into a structure of interrelation that is directed towards the intent of the actualized superior position, regardless of its balance of subjective and objective intent. Enforcement of contracts, apex of power. The discrepancy of perceptive and manipulative abilities results in different organisms within the environment having different degrees of influence and influential potential. At the superior position, the apex of power within the environment, the degree of influence held may grow to be sufficient to enforce manipulation to its interest. The enforcement of interest is separate from the development of interest. The development of interest refers to the active pursuit of interest and the development of structure and content as a result of the manipulation alone. The development itself attracts adherence to which it holds relevance of import. The enforcement of interest refers to the maintaining of influential position, not through prime inherent development, but rather through the coercion of other interests, such that they might provide prime inherent development where it would otherwise be lacking. To the extent the apex power maintains its perception and manipulative ability as relative to others, it may maintain and consolidate its apex position. To maintain position, the apex power imports to its purpose a collective set of perceptive and manipulative ability that will allow it to outperform competitors by more efficiently avoiding threat and by more efficiently pursuing potential. To avoid threat and pursue potential, the apex structures its developed form to take full advantage of available resources and diminish the access of others to those resources according to design. The apex interest maintains informational control by provisioning that which it relies upon with the specific information necessary for that peripheral power to serve the apex interest. Through layering, segmentation, and compartmentalization, the apex power gradually instigates the further specification of function of each peripheral interest until no organism but itself has access to the totality of information required to operate as the apex interest. In addition, the apex interest maintains informational control by preventing the export of information outside of the boundaries of its interests, so as to ensure that any value gained as a result of perception or manipulation be capitalized by the apex interest to the greatest extent possible without benefit accruing to interests adverse or potentially adverse to the apex interest. Enforcement of contracts, periphery of power. To the extent an organism's abilities are less than that of the apex, its ability to manipulate outside of the will of the apex is decreased. The further from the apex, the more diminished the peripheral power of influence. In the event of conflict, the peripheral power's ability to enforce interaction to its interest is greatest where it is itself apex over that which stems from and relies upon it. It is equal with other peripherals of equal influence within the context of the external apex, and lesser than other peripherals that hold a position closer to the external apex. The peripheral power is thus limited to externally allowed self-determination within the context of the influence of the apex power. As a result, the peripheral organism is manipulable to the extent of its lesser power of influence relative to the apex power, its reliance on the apex power as a source of provision, and its adaptability in reference to the evolving interest of the apex power. The adaptability of the peripheral organism pertains not only to the necessity of innate provision, but also to the extent of subjective structure and objective structure. In the context of objective structure, the innate requirements must be fulfilled to the extent possible within the context of objective need. Conflict with objective need arises to the extent of the discrepancy of internalized subjective intent and objective intent. In the case of adaptability to imposed subjective structure, the relationship between the apex and peripheral interests is of coercion by the apex to the extent the imposed subjective requirement differs from innate or objective need. The coercion is possible to the extent the apex is relied upon for innate provision or subjective provision that is misconstrued to be objective provision. The measure of adaptability is the extent to which the periphery organism may accept outcomes that align with the subjective need of the apex interest rather than the objective need of the peripheral organism. Commerce, objective and subjective growth, internalization and externalization. Enterprises and entities, reliance on extant systems. To the extent the apex may develop the extent of its periphery, the more entrenched the apex becomes in terms of the reliance of others upon it. Where reliance develops towards a diminishing array of apex powers, the greater the threat to the market as a whole, where and to the extent apex powers fail to adhere to the provisioning of objective need. Reliance on the apex has the effect of conditioning periphery interests towards alignment with apex interests. Alignment is generated through the apex power of influence, both in generating the structure to which all periphery interests must adhere, and through its power of influence over the determination of how adherence is to be measured. The apex influence in manifested form is the enterprise, the collective organism, and the periphery influences are the entities, the individual organisms that manifest the will and purpose of the enterprise through content. Where entities exist solely within the context of enterprises, the potential for them to determine and pursue objective need is limited to the extent that their role within the enterprise allows that consideration. The enterprise creates efficiency towards the desired outcome through the adaptability of the entities that contribute to its purpose to the point of reliance. Where the enterprise provides for innate or objective need as a basis for maintaining the potential for supplementation of investment through development of subjective desire, the market may grow to rely on that enterprise for necessary provision. The destabilization of the enterprise through external management of subjective assertion risks undermining the enterprise's ability to efficiently contribute to the provisioning of innate or objective need. In such a case, the market may allow the enterprise to manifest subjective intent in order to protect itself from the cost of immediate disruption and from the cost of the restructuring that would be required to correct the discrepancy. The cost of restructuring would necessarily include reassignment, where possible, of entity resources, and the loss of entity resources where reassignment is not possible. The conditioned structure known by the entities would have to shift. Such shifts cause friction, a loss of efficiency, and a diminishment of output as the new structure develops. Enterprises and entities, limitation of extant systems. Where the apex enterprise persists in its failure to adhere to objective need and instead conditions its periphery entities to maintain the subjective apex interest through both the structure of investment and the provisioning content that is developed, the potential of the entity to influence its course away from the enterprise's trajectory is limited. The pursuit of the subjective apex intent by periphery entities gives rise to costs. Those costs will be borne only to the extent they are required to be borne by the apex, and only by periphery entities to the extent allowed by the resilience the enterprise has instituted to protect the expression of apex intent that the entities manifest. As the apex interest, the enterprise will protect its own fundamental interest first. In protecting itself, the apex establishes and then takes advantage of a compartmentalized, entity-based structure. This structure allows the enterprise to contain threats to enterprise interests. To the extent of its reliance on its peripherals, the enterprise will protect them as functional facets of its own expression. The peripheral entities within the influence of the apex enterprise act as protective buffers against the attribution of the cost to the fundamental apex interest. While contributing to the manifestation of the intent of the enterprise, their own role is limited to that of an apparently independent subset of interests that joins with other interests within the enterprise only through mutual provision of a distinct function that is separate from the enterprise as a whole and separate from other entities within the enterprise that are not directly connected to the function in question. The enterprise, through control of intent and through control of manifestation in terms of both structure and content, requires and governs the embodiment of its own apex interest. Simultaneously, through compartmentalization of function, the enterprise protects its interest by establishing the appearance of separation between intent and manifested content. Cost attribution, free will, and expectation. The enterprise, through the conditioning of periphery entities, attributes apparent independent will to those entities. The sense of free will within the imposed structure causes the entity to have the appearance of determinative ability. Where the periphery entities have been sufficiently conditioned, their emotive response mechanisms take on the belief of independence, and thus express independence while maintaining their conditioned position within the structure of the enterprise. The apex enterprise becomes the provisioning environment, and the peripheral entity internalizes the principle of the subjective apex intent regardless of objective need. It is not that there is no deterministic ability in the entity. It is that the deterministic ability is limited to specific function. The enterprise sets the parameters of deterministic expression by limiting expression to that which is consistent with the apex intent. The extent of the compromise is reflected in the difference between the apex intent and the objective potential of the entity. The limitation of potential through conditioning to purpose diminishes the deterministic expression of the entity, but it need not diminish the entity's perception of its own deterministic expression if that perception can be conditioned by the enterprise to form its expectation consistently with the parameters imposed by the enterprise. Cost attribution, deterministic harm and liability. The recognition of the lack of free will in the peripheral entities allows attribution to the apex influence as a matter of deterministic cause. To the extent the enterprise can create and maintain the perception of the maintenance of deterministic will at the entity level, it may insulate itself from the costs that accrue from the subjective function of the entities that comprise the enterprise. Through that structure, the enterprise siphons the fundamental subjective and objective value gained by entities within the enterprise, while protecting itself from the costs that accrue from the pursuit of the subjective interest. In doing so, the enterprise enforces the maintenance of its ability to increase its influence in the market and to further entrench itself systemically within the overall provisioning environment. Content is the expression of structure, which is the expression of intent. Where liability is attributed to the entity, the structure remains, and to the extent the content is removed, it may regrow because the structure remains. The power of regulation in such a case is diminished to the extent it is hindered from reaching the source of the intent. So long as the intent remains, it seeks to achieve its own potential of expression. As a result of this, even where clusters of peripheral entities are dismantled as a result of attribution of costs, where the intent remains, the clusters will grow again. Once deterministic harm has been correctly attributed, then liability may be attached where it is most relevant, at the source of the subjective intent, the point where the intent of the enterprise extends beyond objective need and thus incentivizes the growth of subjective structure and content that corrodes the integrity of the environment within which the specific apex enterprise, with its attendant peripheral entities, exists. Internal governance, myopia and risk management, psychology of foresight, individual myopia. Every entity is both its own apex enterprise and a peripheral entity within the influence of external enterprises. To avoid contributing to subjective investment that results in later magnified attribution and enforced internalization of unaccounted for cost, the individual organism within the collective, the entity within the enterprise, must take rational account of its own susceptibility to the manifestation of subjective intent. The individual entity within the collective enterprise is challenged in this task not only by the structuring of its environment by the collective intent, but also within itself in consideration of its own role as an apex influence within its own subcontext. Within itself, the individual entity is limited by its own construct, the structure and content that its own existence manifests and represents. Unless the entity develops and applies rational consideration for purposes of the internalization of objective need, it will be subject not only to the subjective intent within itself, but also to the external subjective intent of the collective enterprise. The individual entity, through the development of rational awareness, may begin to take account of its own susceptibility to subjective intent. It does this through consideration of the patterns of content that express subjective intent, through realizing the source of the expression, and through developing its comprehension of the means by which the expression was thought sufficiently convincing to be desired. Then, through direct consideration of objective need, the entity may consider the objective as representing a state that is less susceptible to the unnecessary costs that the subjective state inevitably generates. The entity fundamentally must consider the attractiveness of the subjective intent in the satisfaction of the innate survival mechanism, and in what ways that intent requires calibration of emotive response away from objective need. Through this consideration, the entity can see how the subjective hinders perception of all that is not purposed to its intent. The intent's manifestation requires the entity to be conditioned to perceive only that which supports it. Because subjective intent only aligns with objective intent when it becomes objective intent, through alignment of purpose, where the two differ, the subjective must, for its purpose, prevent awareness of objective need. It does this through the prevention of the full functioning of the rational faculty. The subjective intent hinders full awareness by employing a corrupted use of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are structures that hold the potential to train the development of content towards consistency with the subjective intent. When employed to support the subjective intent, they train by diminishing awareness of factors that would trigger contrary consideration, and by incentivizing patterns that create efficiency towards the realization of subjective intent. Cognitive biases are the expression in the subjective space of the influence of the innate emotive response mechanism. They manifest, according to the subjective calibration of the emotive response mechanism, as a conflicting reaction to rational awareness. The calibration of the emotive response mechanism in the innate organism develops automatically according to the actuality of function and the response to that function within the innate environment. In the subjective context, these mechanisms, developed as part of the survival instinct to protect the innate organism, are developed in their calibration to attach to the subjective intent. To the extent the mechanisms are calibrated to the subjective intent, they associate the organism's survival with subjective intent and are thus removed from association with innate need and prevented from accepting objective need to the extent it conflicts with the developed subjective intent. In the case of anchoring bias, the organism develops in the innate environment with an understanding that reflects what it has experienced. Initial perception of the organism's environment sets the initial parameters of its consideration. These primary parameters then affect the organism's perception and consideration of all else that it later encounters. In the innate context, the parameters are defined by the functional actuality of the organism within itself, the organism within the collective, and the provisioning environment on which the innate collective relies. In the subjective context, these parameters may, through conditioning, be shifted from the innate, so as to encourage a specific perception and consideration of later encountered manifestation, so as to encourage or discourage particular outcomes according to the intent of the subjective collective. In the objective context, the parameters are developed from the innate, or reset from the subjective to be in alignment with objective principle according to objective need in light of objective potential. Confirmation bias refers to the preference for new information that supports and affirms current position and trajectory over new information that brings current position and trajectory into question. In the innate context, the preference for confirmation is rooted in the innate instinct for collective activity as a means of avoiding inertia and the threat that arises as a result of inertia. In the subjective context, the avoidance of inertia is harnessed by the subjective intent to protect the unquestioned manifestation of that intent. In order to maintain efficiency towards that intent, the collective channels the consideration of individual organisms towards information that is consistent with the subjective intent and diminishes to the extent possible exposure to conflicting information that might weaken the subjective individual resolve by which the enterprise is perpetuated. In the objective context, the preference develops from the innate survival drive to fuel resolve towards the objective and protect against subjective interests that would draw intent away from objective need and towards unnecessary cost to objective intent and environmental provision. The reactive bias is brought into play as an emotive response to that which threatens that which is understood to be known, where the organism associates with a particular expression of intent, and where that expression is brought into question. The organism instinctually protects and defends what it knows, and guards against threats to the pre-existing proven order that it knows. In the innate context, the organism cannot afford to trust anything that is unknown. It learns only to trust that which it knows and has no subjective or objective ability to discern value beyond basic survival consideration. In the subjective context, the organism, unconsciously knowing the objective precariousness of its subjective position and unconsciously recalling the precariousness of its innate position, protects its expression as the justifying purpose of the structure that it itself is the expression of. In the objective context, where the emotive response mechanism has been calibrated to parameters representing objective need, the organism employs a reactive mechanism against subjective threat to collective objective interest. Decline bias is the inclination to distort the perception of the past in order to see it as of greater value than it was, and the perception of the future as of lesser value than it is likely to be. In the innate context, this inclination invests the present with the innately internalized recognition of the potential for negative development as an instigator for active pursuit of that which fuels and protects survival. In the subjective context, this inclination is recalibrated to apply to the subjective interest and the avoidance of previously experienced costs. By maintaining the view in the present of the past as being of positive value, the subjective interest coerces the present and future intent to maintain allegiance to and alignment with the subjective intent despite increasing apparent costs in the present. In the objective context, the inclination is not automatically towards the decline or incline of trajectory, but rather to a determination of trajectory as measured specifically against the parameters of objective need and intent. Where the determination considers a trajectory of manifestation away from objective need and towards subjective intent, the determination made reflects as closely as possible the actuality of the difference in the trajectory and the difference in the probability of potential being reached, so long as that trajectory is maintained. Bias that stems from fundamental errors of attribution occurs when, in determining attribution, the organism leans towards considering structural cause in content developed by others and avoids consideration of structural cause in itself in favor of attribution by situational cause. In the innate context, the organism inherently trusts its own structural cause while not trusting what it does not know, and as a result of that assumes, as a mechanism evolved through survival, anything unknown to be a potential threat. The innate organism interacts as a matter of inherent construct, and so inherently and unconsciously understands all to be a representation of underlying structural expression. The risk for the innate organism, developed through the recognition in the innate environment, is that not everything that seems non-threatening as a matter of content proves an experience to be non-threatening. The structural intent of content can apply to make content seem non-threatening in order to enhance opportunity for exploitation to satisfy its structural need. In the subjective context, the innate mechanism distorts into avoidance of consideration of the nature of subjective intent and the extent to which subjective intent has subverted innate need-based intent. The failure to consider internal subjective intent causes a subjective organism to take for granted its own structural intent as being of value, while retaining the assumption of potential structural threat from that which is unknown. In the objective context, the organism has examined its own structural intent and calibrated its emotive response mechanism to the objective intent. Having re-established the calibration of emotive response to need, it retains its innate lack of trust and associated need to examine structural intent in order to develop trust. It directs its examination according to compliance with consistent objective principle and is particularly sensitive to respond with distrust to any indication of subjective structural intent within its environment. The false reality bias allows the ability to affect subjective content through subjective conditioning. In the innate context, organisms exist strictly according to their actuality. Perception is directly responsive to the directly apparent nature of the environment, as it is to the organism according to the organism's instinct. In the subjective context, the organism is conditioned to separate perception from the direct reality of its environment, and yet also to understand its perception as reality in order to instigate investment in the subjective intent. This action causes a discrepancy in the relationship between understanding developed from observation of its own internal emotive response, according to subjective perspective, and the actuality of its own standing in itself and in its environment. In the objective context, the organism configures the emotive mechanism to respond to objective need. By removing the subjective perspective, the objective organism utilizes its rational faculty to maintain the connection between emotive response and the actuality of relevant manifestation. The internalized cost bias is seen in the inclination to invest further despite previous investment being lost. In the innate context, the organism maintains its innate interest towards its inherent need to perpetuate itself through an evolutional process of regeneration. This process requires perpetuation even in response to almost total loss. The hardship experienced, where allowed to undermine the emotive investment in survival, results in failure of the regenerative process. On this basis, the strength of the survival mechanism prevents the failure of regeneration, resulting from a loss of impetus due to trauma of past experience. In the subjective context, where intent is based not on innate need, but on interest in the development of structure and content that is dislocated from need, the risk develops that the organism may attribute emotive power required for survival instead to the development of structure and content pertinent to the pursuit of subjective interest. Where, due to its dislocation from need in the context of the actuality of the environment, the content pertinent to subjective interest fails, then, because the attributing organism associates with that interest and treats it as if necessary, and because it invests as if for purposes of survival, the organism also fails. In the objective context, the organism calibrates and develops its emotive response mechanism to serve evolving regeneration according to objective need. In this way, the organism prevents the possibility of lost investment, as failure is only possible where it is inevitable as a result of influence outside of the organism's control. Bias occurs when knowledge, through the development of humility, undermines confidence, and thus allows that with less knowledge to fill the absence of activated direction with the power of naive impetus. In the innate context, naive impetus is the expression of the raw survival instinct in navigation of the environment. It allows direct and immediate action of intent without the delay of consideration. It relies on inherent instinctual expression of innate need towards the inherently understood interest of the organism within the innate provisioning environment. In the subjective context, where a degree of innate security is attained and longevity is increased, the potential for the expression of reflective understanding develops. Where reflective understanding can be applied through the magnifying influence of naive impetus, then its interests will be magnified in their influence. Reflective understanding results from the realization of both capability and incapability. In the case of capability, the reflective understanding develops a subjective interest and applies it through naive impetus. In the case of incapability, the reflective understanding exhibits the result of traumatic response and develops a subjective intent to the extent it can to compensate for the threat it realizes as a result of its considered realization of vulnerability. Where the subjective intent is realized too far from the actuality of the provisioning environment, the discord between the subjective intent and the actualized environment increases, causing the experienced organism to be confronted with the disconnect between its subjective understanding and the actuality of what it has experienced. In the extreme, this approach undermines the experienced understanding's maintenance of confidence in its own perception, to the extent its inherent power of influence is subverted by the raw naive impetus in the pursuit of the subjective intent the naive impetus has been conditioned to manifest. In the objective context, the experienced understanding maintains its allegiance to need by focusing on the realization and actualization of objective principle and develops internal structure to challenge naive impetus towards a realization of objective principle. In maintaining correct comprehension of environment and the interrelation between itself and the environment, the organism maintains a successful realization of regeneration of itself in its environment with sufficient efficiency to provide the security to evolve towards objective need. The connection bias causes emotive signification of the connection of external events to aspects of conscious interest, so as to allow the construction and the promotion and influence of the statement of purpose that results from the perceived connection. In the innate context, the organism is, as a matter of evolved structure and content, sensitive to connections of varying apparent significance in its environment. The perception of pattern and the attribution of meaning reflect automatic emotive responsiveness to manifestation that, as a result of experience, signify content known to be of relevance and import to the organism within the provisioning environment. The significance of pattern pertains both to provision and to threat. In the subjective context, the organism maintains the innate inclination towards recognition of pattern and interest in attribution of significance to pattern where relevant to survival and regeneration, but applies the inclination within the subjective context to subjective artificial pattern. Subjective artificial pattern does not hold the actual referential depth of integrity that the pattern to be considered in the innate context holds. Instead, it refers to the structure of its subjective intent, which may hold only the most tenuous link to actual referential integrity, in that it may apply only superficially to manifestation with no actual import to innate or objective need. By encouraging the ascribing of meaningful value to subjective pattern, the organism can be manipulated further towards subjective intent, either by its own subjective impetus or by an encouraging external subjective impetus. In the objective context, the organism structures its recognition of connection by calibrating its intent towards the objective. With intent established towards the objective, the significance of the patterns it registers will be valued according to their representation of the principles required to be manifested by the objective. In addition, the organism, in establishing itself with internalized objective interest, distinguishes between patterns signifying subjective and objective intents. Organisms recognize and interact with their environment to the extent they have realized the extent of their interconnection with their environment. To the extent of internalization of their apex principle, they recognize the patterns that pertain in that context according to that apex principle. The pertaining significance attributed to the pattern is the measure of investment of intent towards the end the pattern implies. Where organisms direct their power of intent towards their objective need, their sensitivity to pattern, representing the requirements of that need, develops to both feed and guide the organism's development towards the objective. Bias in framing is the allowing of influence based on the familiarity of the appearance of the alignment of the appearance with perceived interest. In the innate context, framing is inherent and automatic as a result of the innate and experiential knowledge of the organism. It is reliable to the extent it is accurate, and in the innate context, it is, as a matter of necessity, largely reliable. That which is familiar is that which is known, whether as to its provisioning potential or as to its threat potential. In the subjective context, this innate mechanism is employed to the benefit of the subjective interest by aligning the subjective content with the appearance of innately valued content through the calibration of the emotive response mechanism. As a subjective organism is conditioned to accept and expect the content, it is influenced to align with the subjective structure that underlies the content, regardless of whether that subjective structure satisfies innate or objective need. In the objective context, the organism aligns its expectation with objective necessity by framing its interest according to objective principle. By familiarizing itself with the distinction between objective and subjective intents, it may navigate towards the objective through increased familiarity with the content of objective structure and increased distancing from recognized subjective content. Related to that is the bias that favors the known. This is the preference for the familiar in the provision of trust, and the wariness towards the unfamiliar in the provision of trust. In the innate context, the favoring of the known is the association of the organism with that which sustains it to the extent of reliance. This gradated valuation is applied first to the family unit of the organism, and then to the extended family and innate collective community of the organism, to the extent the community acts in informal concert to attend to common threats or in the seeking of common provision. In the subjective context, the favoring of the close is injected with subjective intent. The result is a securing of loyalty of purpose, but towards results that may have only tenuous links to innate need and may be regardless of objective need. In this context, the importance placed on loyalty to the known unit overcomes the importance of adherence to actuality. To the extent the loyalty is infused with the emotive force of subjective intent, the loyalty may be manipulated away from objective principle. The loyalty becomes a defense mechanism of the collective, not for shared innate purpose, but for shared subjective interest. In the objective context, the organism internalizes objective principle and calibrates its expectation according to that principle. By developing loyalty to objective principle rather than loyalty to specific subjective intent, the organism attributes its loyalty of effort and its power of resilience to the principles where and to the extent they are reflected in actuality, regardless of and despite conflicting potential subjective loyalties to external subjective intent. The collective contribution is in the collective aid provided towards the objective need, and in the collective defense against the threat to the objective collective posed by both innately pertinent threats and by threats resulting from subjective intent. Psychology of Foresight, Collective Myopia. Where the entities that embody collective intent are individually harnessed to subjective intent at the individual level, collectively they will lack the rational perception to consider the collective effort according to objective need. The collective magnifies and empowers the intent and ability of the combined entities. Where the combined intent is subjective, the collective empowers the subjective. The empowering of the individual intent through the influence achieved by the collective gives rise to a sense of security. This security exists within both the confidence inspired by the success achieved through empowerment and the confidence of purpose derived through the alignment of interests. Where the interests are aligned, regardless of the objectivity of their purpose, the individual is sheltered from external pressure to even consider the fundamental need to adjust. Where all entities within the enterprise are so aligned with collective purpose, the purpose may be pursued with the greatest immediate efficiency and yet with the least power of internal governance. Managing risks, response-based management. Where internal governance of the entity or enterprise fails, externalized costs accrue to be borne by the environment and by neighboring entities and enterprises within the environment. To the extent the overall collective allows the costs to accrue, the costs increase. Where the overall collective waits before responding, not only do costs externalized by the offending enterprise accrue, but the influence of the offending enterprise is maintained over the structure and content of its own embodiment and the structure and content of that which is reliant upon it. Where the environment disallows the costs and attributes them to perceived cause, it functions to manage the costs in response to their already existent state. This existent state is immediately perceptible in terms of content, but also includes the underlying structure of the expectation of the reliant entities. The structural intent that gives rise to content has received the investment of all that supports it, and all of that which supports it relies upon it to the extent of its investment. Once the manifestation has been brought into being and entities have been conditioned to its provision, any act of management that may in the individual subjective perspective be considered a threat to what is known and expected will be reacted against to the extent of its conflicting individual intent. Response-based management of the offending enterprise is thus limited through its own structure in both the prevention of costs resulting from the collective manifestation of subjective intent and in its ability to effectively contain the intent once manifested. Managing risks. Risk-based management. To avoid the structural limitation of response-based management, the objective collective must employ risk-based management. Risk-based management can be applied through rule or principle. Where applied through rule, risk-based management remains subject to activation by response. Rule-based risk management applies in an advanced subjective collective context, where the subjective enterprise is able to recognize risks to its intent by recognizing the structure of competing subjective interests, or through recognizing competing objective interests, while understanding them merely as competing subjective interests, and acts to affect their potential for manifestation to the extent they are contrary to the subjective collective intent. Rule-based risk management also applies in an objective collective environment where residual subjective intents threaten development towards the manifestation of objective principles. Those threats, because based in subjective intent, cannot be managed by objective principle because the objective principle has not been internalized by the entities giving rise to the threats. Until the objective principle has been internalized by the entity through conditioning according to the objective principle, but applied through rule-based risk management, it cannot be relied upon to govern itself consistently with the objective principle. Where principle-based, the control mechanism avoids the cost of the response limitation by requiring potential structure be considered for adherence to principle before structure or content can be manifested, such as may produce unnecessary costs, whether internalized or externalized. In considering structure rather than content, principle-based management is designed to sensitize itself to potential for realization through content rather than to content once realized. By attending to consideration of structure, and through familiarization with the pattern of subjective intent as set against the pattern of known objective principle, the objective collective may avoid the conditioning of the entities within the environment into reliance on the subjective interest, and thereby make more efficient the collective's ability to both correct pre-existing subjective growth and prevent future subjective development. Internal governance. Finance and underwriting, funding growth, maintenance-based growth. The potential investment of intent in any given temporal context is finite and so must be considered for efficiency towards purpose. While the traditional principle does not seek growth beyond innate survival instinct, the conservative and liberal principles apply in the subjective context to govern the growth of subjective intent. Maintenance-based growth is growth developed through the conservative principle. It is as valuable as that which it in fact maintains. Where that which it maintains is aligned with subjective need, maintenance-based growth, through the conserving and reinforcing of subjective gains, increases the subjective potential of the collective enterprise. In so doing, it brings subjective value to the entities that, through their manifestation, are consistent with the strengthening of the resilience of the subjective enterprise. Maintenance-based growth in the subjective context is the preservation of the continued manifestation of the subjective interest. The conservative principle need not pertain to the entirety of the current state. It may pertain to the feeding of a specific fundamental subjective interest over time. In this sense, a conservation empowered by the apex interest does not imply the intent to conserve all aspects of the current environment. Maintenance-based growth in the objective context is functionally equivalent to maintenance-based growth in the subjective context. In the objective context, where the fundamental interest of the enterprise is the internalization of objective principle and the manifestation of objective interest, maintenance-based growth is conditioned upon the conserving and reinforcing of objective gains so as to protect the potential for the provisioning of continued efficient evolution. In both subjective and objective cases, the core is a recognition of the vulnerability of the enterprise to threats of loss to subjective or objective potential. The conservative principle recognizes the precariousness of the balance of collective interaction and the potential costs that can arise where that balance is shifted. Funding growth, disruption-based growth. Where subjective investment has been made such as to produce externalized costs, or where the conservative element has resulted in inertia in the actual evolution towards perceived potential, disruption-based growth becomes necessary. Disruption-based growth takes place in the subjective context, where entities or enterprises operating according to subjective intent grow at the expense of the subjective interests of others. Disruption occurs when the accelerated growth of a subjective interest changes the balance of the subjective environment. The shifting balance represents the adjustment of the reliance of entities within the subjective environment. Entities within the environment shift to take provision from a new source, and the shift entails a cost to the enterprises or entities that previously held that reliance. Disruption-based growth emanates from the liberal principle and is only as valuable as the actual result of its instigation. Where disruption-based growth undermines objective intent in service of subjective purpose, its value is negative. Where disruption-based growth undermines subjective growth for purposes of alignment with objective need, its value is positive. Disruption-based growth in the subjective context does not necessarily increase the value of the collective. With disruption comes a cost of the restructuring, including the undermining of the consistency of security required for the generation of objective consideration. Further, disruption of the subjective intent towards objective intent requires a restructuring of that part of the subjective that feeds the potential for development towards the objective, alongside the dismantling of the part of the subjective that feeds the subjective. Where the subjective enterprise has been allowed to develop to the point of a significant discrepancy with objective interest, it may be at risk of collapse in the event of the dismantling and restructuring. The enterprise must be able to adapt if it is not to be extinguished. Where it is not able to adapt, the necessity for dismantling reaches to that part of the enterprise that held the possibility of serving objective intent, and objective potential can be diminished as a result. Loss prevention, mitigation. In the context of embodied manifestation, change is constant and all interests are potentially threatened by all that has the influential power to coerce them to external interest or to extinguish them completely. To avoid unnecessary loss of achieved value, the enterprise utilizes the resources available to weaken the potential for loss. At the innate level, the resources available include the inherent characteristics that mitigate threats within the innate environment. In the subjective context, innate threats still apply, but have lesser immediate import. Instead, immediate threats develop from competing subjective interests that have the potential to then bring about innate level risk through control of the provisioning environment. In the objective context, with innate provision secured, the threat is from subjective interests that distort the balance of the provisioning environment and undermine the achievement of objective principle. Mitigation requires the development of risk-based management. While mitigation may be in response to loss, it functions to prevent future loss. It is a method by which the organism either weakens a threat or strengthens its resilience to the threat. Where mitigation is applied in service of objective principle, it decreases the inevitable potential for costs to arise that may weaken the integrity of the provisioning environment and thereby hinder the potential for the evolution of the organisms that rely on that environment. Mitigation also allows the diminishment of the inevitable costs associated with the development and application of subjective intent. In order to mitigate against the manifestation of subjective interests, the objective intent must apply itself to understanding the root of subjective intent at the apex level. Mitigation as a preventative measure must recognize the core structural pattern of the apex intent in order to identify the source intent, and then must apply rule-based influence on the source until it is conditioned sufficiently to internalize the objective principle. Loss prevention, adaptation. Where externalization has occurred, and where those costs have accrued to the point of actualized objective detriment, the organism must adapt to the context as it stands and the context of the recalculated objective potential. Adaptation is only possible to the extent allowed by the inherent structure of the organism and the inherent provisioning capacity of the environment as pertinent to the organism. Minor adaptation is possible as a matter of employing the basic agility necessary to navigate the dynamic structure of interactive innate manifestation. Major adaptation, by contrast, means a significant redirection of resources from a prior investment. Redirection of resources on a major scale means the abandoning of pre-existing structure and content and the development of new structure and content from a diminished position of security. Where the costs are great and the potential for provisioning shifts too much or in too short a time for effective adaptation to take place, there is a loss of objective potential. Where the costs are sufficient to change the environment such that it no longer provides for the organism, and the organism is unable to regenerate sufficiently to evolve to meet the new provisioning potential, then the organism becomes extinct. Objective imagination, commerce, conclusion. Markets are made up of enterprises and the entities that support them. This structure of apex and peripheral powers of influence develops out of unequal abilities in the processing and application of resources available in the provisioning environment. Where subjective intent is embodied, innate traits, while maintaining their association to emotive import, are calibrated towards resilience on subjective apex interests within the collective environment. The embodiment of subjective intent diverts manifestation from accordance with innate need and distracts from the development of objective principle while externalizing costs to the provisioning environment. The development of objective intent requires a mitigation of potential harm arising as a result of the embodiment of subjective intent. Mitigation is a form of risk management that, in the subjective context, must first be applied through the application of rules. Once conditioning through persistence and consistency of rule has occurred sufficiently for the managed entity to internalize objective need, then risk management may be employed through internally directed principle-based governance. Where the entity is unable to adapt to the changing conditions in the required time to prevent unnecessary harm, then it must be allowed to fail.